This is Duke University.
In this panel, we have the pleasure of speaking with Anabel González, who has a very distinguished career both in international organizations and at the national policy level. Anabel worked for a number of years at the World Trade Organization, then became trade minister in Costa Rica during the previous presidential term, and now beginning, I guess, July of this year, after her term as trade minister in Costa Rica, she's moved to the World Bank, and she is heading up a global practice in trade and competitiveness, and we'll definitely ask Anabel to tell us more about what's going on at the World Bank. So I think, and I also would like to introduce my co-panelist, Karina Fernandez-Stark. Karina got her Master's in International Development Policy degree here at Duke in the Sanford School of Public Policy. She's been working at the Center on Globalization, Governance, and Competitiveness as a researcher for a number of years, and she's now part of our CGGC South contingent. She's in Santiago, Chile, along with Penny Bamber, both of whom live there and continue to work with CGGC. And Karina was one of the key members of our CGGC team doing a study on global value chains in Costa Rica that was launched by Anabel. So that'll be another topic we'll certainly want to talk about. So we're going to follow the same format. Karina and I will each ask Anabel some questions on her experience and really get her to tell us a little bit more about what's her vision of the role of global value chains and development from her different vantage points. So maybe I'd like to start and ask you a similar question to what we asked Pascal Lamy, former Director General of WTO. Given that you've been working at these different levels in the WTO, then as a national trade minister in Costa Rica, and now coming back to the World Bank, but what got you started in thinking about global value chains as a useful framework or tool in promoting trade and development issues as you've experienced them?
Thank you very much, Gary and Karina. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I started my professional career many years ago at a time when my country, Costa Rica, had come out of the most important economic crisis that it had had, and this was in the early 80s. And the country at the time was basically a producer of commodities, coffee, bananas, sugar, beef, a little bit of industrial production geared towards the Central American market. But as a result of the crisis, the country had to sort of change its developmental model and started to look into, what could it do? Because it was clear that it could not continue to grow based on coffee or bananas. So it decided that it had a good political stability, good economic stability after the crisis. It had a skilled population. So it sort of put together an agency that at the time was an investment promotion agency and more of a development agency, if you wish, that decided they would begin to put a value proposition together to attract investment. Investment originally came in the textile and apparel area. This was a time when China was nowhere to be seen in the economic in the world trade scenario. Of course, neither Bangladesh or some of the other Asian countries, but even some Central American countries who later became important exporter of textiles and apparel were still very much involved in guerrilla wars at the time. So Costa Rica became a very attractive destination for textiles and apparel. And this began to transform the country as such. And it was at that time that I began to work in the trade and investment area. First in the Ministry of Foreign Trade at the time. And I remember at that time reading, I think probably should have been one of your first studies, Gary, on the textile value chain. So this was the first time I was actually acquainted with the concept and the framework of global value chains, which I found very interesting at the time. But I was more, at that time, I was working mostly on trade policy as such at the Ministry of Foreign Trade. So, you know, things continue to evolve in the country. In 1997, there was a very important, this was a very important moment for Costa Rica, turning point, when Intel Corporation decided to establish a chip manufacturing plant in the country. This was very relevant because this was the largest investment in the country at the time. Of course, the fact that a company like Intel had chosen Costa Rica was a seal of approval in terms of the investment climate of the country, in terms of the skill set that you can find in the country. And from there on, Costa Rica actually, I think, took advantage of that opportunity to build on it, to begin to attract companies in a number of areas, in electronics, then in medical devices, then a little bit in automotive or in aeronautics, and the offshore services industry, as you know very well. So when I came, I worked at the Ministry of Foreign Trade for a number of years. I then directed Costa Rica's investment promotion agency and started actually working on the medical devices sector quite a lot and tried to develop the value chain in Costa Rica's participation in that value chain. Then moved to the WTO, then moved back into government. And when I became a minister about 4.5 years ago, I looked at all of what had happened in terms of Costa Rica's integration into value chains, that I thought we need to look at this in a more systemic way. The country has been a very good success story, particularly in the Latin American context, where there is not a lot of integration into global value chains in some of these areas. That I decided that we needed to look a little bit more into this. So I reached out to a number of organizations, institutions, people that I knew, to ask them, how can you help us in understanding better what is the role for Costa Rican global value chains, and what more can we do to strengthen and expand our participation in global value chains? And as you know well, one of the key partners that I approached, it was the two of you working here at the center, to ask you to perform a study on mapping Costa Rica's participation in global value chains. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. I also went to IDE Jetro because actually Pascal was saying that he connected with IDE Jetro. And I myself, I assumed office in Costa Rica in May 2010. And in June 2010, I went to the WTO and met with Pascal, who had been my boss immediately before, and said, well, what are you working on? And he asked me, what are your interests? And I started talking a little bit about this, and he said, you should connect to IDE Jetro. So in fact, through him and through another good friend at the WTO, Hubert Eskite, we connected with IDE Jetro, and we started a relationship that was very important in helping Costa Rica construct an input-output table with the guidance of IDE Jetro. Then we also went to the Korean Development Institute. We also went to the OECD. So we produced, I think, a very strong knowledge base for understanding what is it that, how is it that Costa Rica is connected to global value chains, and what should the country do next in strengthening and expanding its participation. And now that I come to the World Bank Group 4 months ago in this new capacity as a senior director of the Global Practice on Trade and Competitiveness, the first thing that I did is, I sat there and I said, there's huge capacity at the World Bank Group. In this practice that I lead, we have trade, investment, competitiveness, innovation, entrepreneurship, all of them sitting here together. We have the connection with the IFC, which is our private sector branch that is involved in investment and in bringing investors to countries. So I thought this is a great opportunity, to put together an integrated offering for assisting developing countries to connect to value chains, to strengthen and expand their participation in value chains, and to make value chain also a cornerstone of sustainable and inclusive growth in developing countries. So right now we are working in putting that offering together, and I'm very excited because I have had the opportunity of looking at value chains from many different perspectives, and I hope that now in this new capacity I will be able to put all the to leverage the strength of the World Bank Group to serve our clients, developing countries, in their participation in value chains.
Great, thank you. Let me just pick up on one of the things you were saying about Costa Rica to broaden this out to Latin America more generally. You noted that the country would change its development model pretty markedly in terms of trying to go from an exporter of primary products into higher technology export industries, and electronics through the Intel investment led the way, and then you identified other industries like medical devices and others that were important. In our work at the center, we also noticed that a handful of smaller economies that have really been focusing on human capital, and Chile definitely comes to mind, were very, I think, proactive in approaching us and global value chain researchers to help them figure out what might be their niche in the new sort of global economy that was emerging. And in Chile, we did a study on offshore services over a couple of years with Corfo that paralleled the study we did in Costa Rica. The question I'm curious about is, within Latin America more generally, where a handful of countries are involved in the high-tech manufactured goods exports, but a lot of other countries are still very much in the primary product model. Do you see a sort of broader uptake of interest in global value chains, or is it mediated by the kind of export profile that countries have?
Well, I think that, when commodity prices were very high, driven, of course, by the demand in China and in Asia, dedicated to infrastructure, buildings and everything, it was very difficult to get a number of these countries interested in global value chains because for a number of reasons, it's basically they were doing very well. Some of them were growing at levels of, say, 7-8%. Based on commodities, and there was like a new excitement about the possibility of actually achieving significant growth through natural resources and extractives. Now that this has begun to change a little bit, I think, and that global value chains have become a bit more prevalent in some countries in Latin America, I think a new interest has emerged on global value chains. And if you look at countries that are members of the Pacific Alliance, for instance, Mexico, of course, has been very connected to global value chains. It's one big global value chain, right, connected with the U.S. in many ways. Yeah, but if you look at some of the other countries, I find that there is a great interest in developing regional value chains and local value chains, including with Chile, that is also connected to global value chains. But to a lesser extent, Peru or Colombia, very strong, of course, on natural resources. You see an enhanced interest on the part of these countries to connect to global value chains. And of course, as you know very well, you can connect, yes, in electronics, but you can also connect at many different levels, and maybe even your natural resource base may be a way of connecting through global value chains by providing, for example, enhanced engineering services, as is the case of Chile, which is an excellent example of using or taking advantage of the strong base that they have in natural resources, but moving into activities that also make use of the human capital, because you were referring to this, and connect to the global economy in a way in which more value added takes place actually in Chile. I think in Latin America, a number of countries have also strong human resource bases. And from this perspective, they should also be in a good position to connect to global value chains. But having said this, it is not automatic. It will not happen by coincidence, by chance, by luck. No, you need to work on this. You need to have a clear vision. You need to have a plan to address, the constraints that limit your participation in global value chains. And these constraints may be different from, for one country to another. It may be limitations to foreign direct investment. It may be a mismatch between your human capital and the demands of the marketplace. It may be your ports, terrible infrastructure, or it may be logistics, or it may be restrictions in the area of services, lack of competitiveness in particular sectors. So there may be many different binding constraints to participating in global value chains. But I think that if a country develops a clear vision, they identify this constraint with the support of people like you here at the center, what you do here, or at the offering that we want to bring in the World Bank Group, I think that there is an important opportunity that can be taken advantage of.
Great, thank you.
Anabel, as you mentioned earlier, during your time as a Minister of Foreign Trade in Costa Rica, you were a keen advocate of using the global value chain analysis to support the country's upgrading, especially in industries like medical devices and offshore services. But how was the global value chain analytical framework useful to inform industrial policy in your country? And how practical is this framework for the implementation of policies?
I think it is a very useful framework because it is not possible, if you come to think of the development process of a country, it is not possible to focus on everything at the same time. No government can do this. There's limited time, limited political resources, limited economic resources. So you need to decide where are you going to put your efforts. And I think that this framework provides you with a very useful instrument to inform your decision process. In the case of Costa Rica, some of the studies that were done, I think, were particularly useful in promoting the adoption of certain policies that maybe the country was aware that it needed to adopt, but that maybe it needed a bit more of support in doing so. And I'm thinking, for instance, particularly in the area of human capital. This is a country that has invested for a long time, as I was saying, and it has a strong human capital base. But there is a gap between the demands of a lot of the companies that are established in the country and the type of both at the professional, at the tertiary level, and at the vocational level, between some of the skills that are taught and those that are demanded by the company. So I think one of the studies that you produced, or all of them, actually had a very important element regarding how can you align the skills with the demands of the marketplace. So we put together at the time a council that was composed, a committee that was composed by several government institutions, including the Ministry of Foreign Trade, the Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Labor, with representatives from all public universities and a number of private universities, also in close contact with the companies. And we came about with a plan to how can we strengthen the core offering of some of these vocational training institutes, of some of the universities, so as to work more in the area of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I think that plan was put together based on some of the recommendations that you produced in some of the studies. So again, the framework basically provides a useful instrument to focus your time, your political capital, your economic resources into producing results that will then bring about, will act as, I would say, a virtuous circle because you're able to strengthen your position in terms of attracting investment. You are able to strengthen your position in terms of improving the absorptive capacity of the country. You're able to strengthen your the possibility of creating new jobs. So all of this, I think, is very relevant when you are a policymaker with the responsibility of promoting growth, creating jobs in your country.
Well, just to follow up, I think having done a lot of these global value chain studies through CGGC with countries, one of the key challenges is precisely this implementation.
Mm-hmm.
Not just what the report concludes, but how do you actually change behavior? Mm-hmm. And I have two really strong memories of the study in Costa Rica because Anabel was a very sort of tough client. One thing she told us is when you do these studies and you come up with your conclusions, don't just tell us what the problem is, but include solutions to that problem that might be coming from other countries that have experienced this. And in particular, I remember on human capital was one of the key issues that we had heard about in doing these different studies where the industries like medical devices or like offshore services would actually start growing very fast, and then they run into some key bottlenecks. Yeah, we need certain kinds of managers, or we need certain kinds of R&D support. And so one of the themes that you pushed was, okay, so where else around the region or around the world might we be able to find solutions? And one of the options came up, well, Mexico was right next door. Mexico actually has universities in some of these same industries that were training people. So she really pushed us to kind of come up with other country cases that are relevant to the situation in Costa Rica. That's one issue that I think was very smart on your side. But the other one, I think, was how to get the private sector involved. And I just want, because when we had to give our presentation on the study, you convened a group of about 120 people in a room that was largely private companies in all the different industries we studied, plus the government people, plus some university people. And I think this idea of creating a council afterwards that brought the government and the private sector and the universities and the vocational training centers together was a kind of a novel and really savvy political decision. The question is, did you sort of have that vision before the study that you needed to create this kind of collaboration across different actors in these different value chains? Or was it something that emerged as you start to see the results coming in? And are there one or two changes that actually occurred in some of the industries we looked at that grew out of this public-private collaboration forum that you created?
Well, as I had worked before in the area of investment promotion in directing Costa Rica's investment promotion agency, I've always been very keen on private-public sector collaboration. I think that private sector requires the government to do a number of things, but the government really needs to listen to what are the constraints that private sector has. So I've always been very keen on this. But of course, when in the context of global value chains, and you make this very clear in your studies, this is not something that is a question of whether you prefer this way of doing it or not. This is really at the essence, of global value chains, of understanding, what are the public policy changes that are required to make sure that you unleash the power of the private sector to continue to grow in your country. Because, I am convinced that the search for talent, and in particular, when you think about human development, the search for talent in the world today is global. I remember talking one time with an executive, a very high-level executive at Hewlett-Packard while visiting Silicon Valley, and he said, well, in a country like Costa Rica, if you graduate 5,000 cloud computing engineers we will hire 5,000 cloud computing engineers. If you graduate 300, we will hire 300. But it is a question for you to decide whether you want to be in the 300 dimension or in the 5,000 dimension. And if you go to larger countries, probably the numbers are larger than that. So this is to say that your study help us focus as a country in this importance of closing the gap between our investments in human education as a country with the demands of these companies in the marketplace. Now, you raised one issue, Gary, which I think is very relevant, which is the ability to implement a number of these recommendations. Because you have, one part of this is, of course, the analytical part, which is you need to understand what is going on at the country level, and you need to be able to map yourself, against other countries to understand, where are you in the value chain? Who are your competitors? What are they doing? This is a very important part of it. Another very important part of it are the concrete recommendations, as you were saying, because yes, you can come and say, all right, you should, you should close the gap. Yes, this is very good, but what does this mean in a particular setting of a particular country? And once you have the recommendations, is how do you make them operational? How can you actually implement them? And this is where, when thinking about all this, and based on this experience, when I came to the bank group, I thought, well, we can certainly work on the analytics. The bank is very strong. The World Bank Group is very strong in the analytics. It can work in tandem with partners, because I think this is very relevant, like the Duke Center for Global Governance and Competitiveness. We can also work at the level of the analytics, producing the recommendations. And in the case of the World Bank Group, I think we have two very important strengths. One is the access to capital, which can be lending to governments, but it can also be this connection with the IFC and access to private investments. And I think this is one very important element. And the other strength that I believe that we have is that we have strong implementation capabilities. As, for instance, in my practice on trade and competitiveness, we have staff in 80 cities all over the world. So we can work hand in hand with governments to make sure that we support them in the implementation of the recommendations that can come out of studies like this. So this is when, when I thought, well, it is time for the World Bank Group to produce an integrated offering to our clients, the developing countries, that can bring together the analytical part of it, the advisory part of it, the lending, the connection with the private investments, and the support for implementation. And I am very excited about this. We are putting the final details to this offering, and we expect to roll it out to our clients probably in about a couple of months. And I'm very excited to start working on this, because I think that for developing countries, global value chains are very, very important instrument to be able to connect to the global economy. And I think that it is by connecting to the global economy that these countries, many of these countries, will be able to generate the jobs that they need, will be able to generate the growth that they need to reach what are our twin goals in the World Bank, which is eradicate poverty and boost shared prosperity. So I see GVCs as a great framework for us to support developing countries achieve the twin goals.
Yeah, I would like to ask you regarding your your new position at the Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice. I understand that you're helping these developing countries to enter into the value chain. This means include them and maybe chains that were not participating before. I imagine that this is mainly in agriculture. If you can explain us what are the main industries in which there are projects, and if you can provide us some examples of your work now at the World Bank.
Well, we basically, what we look at is the specific situation of a country, because we try to produce solutions that are tailor-made to the characteristics of a particular country. And then from there, when we identify this, we look at their peers in the industry or that are at similar levels of development. Because as you very well know, we find, we were talking with Gary before, you have groups of smaller countries trying to integrate into the global economy. You have those that have a stronger agricultural base. You have others where the services industry may be more relevant. So we try to bring about experiences from other countries at similar levels of development, maybe a bit more advanced in some cases, to learn what is it that they have done right. And this can be basically in any industry. It can be in agribusiness. It can be in manufacturing. It can also be in the services sector. We are putting together right now a new offering, again, at the World Bank Group on sustainable tourism. Tourism is, as you very well know, because you have worked in this area as well, this is another area where developing countries can find a driver for growth and for opportunities. And once we do this, we work very closely with the country, and maybe sometimes it is a loan that may be required to strengthen their port infrastructure, for instance. Maybe it's more a question of strengthening their logistics system, their simplifying customs procedures. So, for instance, in the case of a number of countries in East Africa, we are working with them to streamline their customs procedures, because you have a country like Rwanda, for instance, that they have done very well. They have a good investment climate. Yeah. They have made significant progress here, and now they want to make sure they are a landlocked country. Yes. So for them, the issue of trade facilitation is absolutely crucial if they want to integrate into the global economy. So they have been working on projects to streamline their procedures and reducing the transit time, for instance, from the port of Mombasa to Kigali from 21 days to 5 days. This is a major achievement because it will facilitate their integration into the global economy, and with it opportunities for job creation in these countries. Mm-hmm. Now, we work in many different countries in the world. Of course, we are in Croatia. We have a very interesting competitiveness project that is looking at strengthening, again, their participation in the global economy. We also work with other countries, for instance, a country that has been quite successful in this area of global value chains, such as Turkey, for example, mm-hmm. that in the textile and apparel sector moved, as you know, from originally just putting together pieces coming from different countries to now having their own brands all over the world. So the bank, I think, the bank group is uniquely positioned to work with developing countries in supporting them in all of these different sectors, working in collaboration with partners at university level, at the academic sector, with other international institutions as well. So this is why one of the reasons that I'm, as I said, I'm very excited to be in this new position.
Right.
So I have one final question, and then maybe we can open up to the audience. One of the themes in this conference is how international organizations have been evolving as the global economy has evolved. And in our discussion with Pascal Lamy, he was mentioning how the economic crisis of 2008-2009 caused some big changes in what the World Trade Organization was confronting and what it tried to do, and how the Made in the World initiative partly was a response to that. In looking at the World Bank, even though you're just recently there, but you've probably been working with the World Bank over the years, do you see a similar kind of shift? I know, in fact, the World Bank has announced a whole new way of approaching global practices. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about where the World Bank was before this shift, mm-hmm. and what's led it to work in the new directions that you were describing, and in these partnerships. Does that open up a space for the World Bank in particular to collaborate with other international organizations? Maybe you can give us an example or two of that if that's happening.
I think this is very important, Gary, because the world has changed significantly, and international organizations, of course, need to adapt to the new context. And And the World Bank Group is no exception to this. And we are actually going through a very important transformation process that had a very important moment in July 1st with the launching of this global practices. And the aim of the global practices is to better serve our clients, the developing countries, with integrated solutions and to promote the deployment of global knowledge. And I'm going to go a little bit to what the strength of the global, of the World Bank Group are. If you think about access to I mean, when people think about the World Bank Group, they normally think about a bank that lends money. And yes, this is, of course, a very important part of our business. But the reality is that for many countries, the question is not access to capital. They have the resources. The question is more, or you find, the one issue is it's not all about access to capital. When you go, for instance, to some consulting firms, you have access to knowledge, but there are very few institutions that can put together the knowledge with the capital with these implementation capabilities that we have on the ground because of all the staff that we have in different parts of the world. So when we started thinking about, what can our value proposition be for our clients, we have this combination of an integrated solution that brings the knowledge, can bring the capital, and can bring the implementation support. Now, in order for us to do this, we really needed to become a global institution. Because in a way, as our President Kim has said before, we were operating in a way that we were more like 6 regional banks. We had like we were operating in Latin America, or we were operating in Africa or in South Asia. But if you had a great expert sitting in Mexico on some competitiveness issue, it was very difficult to have access to that resource if you were sitting in South Africa, because this expert was mapped to a regional operation, and so his or her boss was not happy with this person going to South Africa and working in South Africa. With the global practices, the knowledge, all of this knowledge is now mapped to the practices as such. So it is our job to make sure that that expert that is sitting in Mexico can actually also support an operation in South Africa, because we are looking at this from the global perspective. So it is this question of global deployment of knowledge alongside with the access to capital, both on the lending side and on the investment side from the IFC, plus the implementation capabilities that I think makes for the World Bank Group, an institution that is transforming itself and has transformed itself to better deal with the realities of the world today. Now, we recognize as part of this identity that we cannot work alone by ourselves. We need to work together with other international organizations and with partners at the private sector, at the academic sector, in the academic sector, because again, what is relevant for a country is this integrated solution. It's not just a partial thing that one of us can bring, but rather how can we work with them in a way in which we address the developmental challenges in this integrated way.
Excellent. Do you have any final, or should we open?
No.
Okay, so let's take the opportunity now to open the floor for comments or questions from anybody in the audience. And I think we'll do a little bit like we did the first session with Pascal and me. We'll group a few comments and questions and then ask Anabel to respond to them directly. So let me start with actually Stephanie Barrientos, and then we'll go to Byung-ho after that.
Thank you. Stephanie Barrientos, University of Manchester. I'm an academic there. And I've done research for many years on global value chains. And I should just say before I ask the question, I work a lot with companies, especially food, agribusiness and food-related companies. So, so my question really relates to something you touched on, and I'd just like you to elaborate, if possible, a little bit more, which is this issue of sustainable and how to promote sustainable inclusive growth, but particularly in countries, for example, in Africa, which are traditionally for a long time focused on agriculture, raw materials, etc. How to help them to move up the value chain when just the basic model of value chains is about value capture by firms much further along the chain who are very good now and very adept at capturing the value and are not necessarily going to support the origin of those agricultural and raw materials, extractive materials industry, extractive commodities, etc. So what kind of support can you give, and will trade and financial facilitation necessarily be enough to ensure that the benefits really get back to the smaller producers, the more casualized workers? And I do get concerned that just the trade facilitation on its own and financial facilitation, all very important, are they really enough? And I should just say, just as a caveat to that, I think this is something that companies themselves are getting now increasingly worried about, certainly in the food sector.
Excellent. Stephanie's also done a lot of work on cocoa and worked with companies like Cadbury, so I think she's seeing this very much from an inside perspective. Thanks. Byung-ho.
Yeah, my name is Byung-ho Kwon. I'm a PhD student in environmental policy, and I'm also very interested in sustainable development and how to integrate global value chain framework into this sustainable development themes. But also, my question is more about the collaboration between these different multi-sector collaboration. I wonder how important it is in actually implementing global value chain, the development strategy, and especially university. You mentioned university and then firm and government, and even inter-firm collaborations. I think it's been increasingly important. So I wonder also what kind of criteria you use actually to select and identify potential partners, and I wonder also, is there any like a failure case that didn't really produce desirable outcomes? So any lessons you learned from that? Thank you very much.
Excellent. Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy Ho. I work at Duke CGC as well. I'm a research associate. You had mentioned a little bit about regional value chains. It's something that's becoming a bit of an emerging trend or an emerging issue. And there seems to be a lot of potential, especially at the implementation stage. You mentioned Rwanda earlier in the East African community. Africa has a number of them, especially maybe around, as Stephanie mentioned, food and supermarkets, things like that. But from your agenda now in your new role at the World Bank, what do you see in terms of first steps or next steps or long terms for promoting regional value chains?
Okay, and we'll take a question in the back, and then we'll stop and let you. Son?
My name is Chen, sorry. I'm from China, and now I'm a graduate student here at Duke. I know for the past 4 years you served as Minister of Foreign Trade of Costa Rica. Since the free trade agreement with Costa Rica and China entered into force in 2011, 90% of international products benefit from the zero tariff. And last year, the trade between the two countries totaled $3.18 billion, according to the Chinese government figures. So my question is, as a former Minister of Foreign Trade, do you think establishing a special economic zone in Costa Rica as an export plan for like Chinese companies would be a win-win situation? If so, how do we avoid the violation of labor laws and environment damages, such social issues that may cause, like China's direct investment in African countries? Thank you.
Great. Okay, a very good set of questions. Easy, Anabel.
All of them are. Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. Now I appreciate the opportunity to reflect upon some of this. In the case of how can you ensure that growth through global value chains is sustainable and inclusive, I think that it should be part of the strategy to connect and upgrade to value chains since the beginning. In this respect, I would say that there are a few elements that I think act as positive forces in this direction. One is, and I believe Pascal was making reference to it, connecting to global value chains today means complying with a set of standards that are normally quite high and that have both environmental and labor components. I think that actually one of the challenges for companies in many developing countries is how to comply with these standards and the resources to be certified as compliant with the standards. But once they do this, I think that this is an important avenue for promoting sustainability in the context of global value chains. Another element that I believe is also quite relevant relates to elements such as trade facilitation, because sometimes I understand that there is the view that trade facilitation will benefit the large company or the large exporter, whereas in reality, I believe that trade facilitation actually makes it feasible for for instance, small farm holders to actually participate in trade. And I'm going to give you an example that I have seen with myself personally, which is if you go to a frontier between African countries, or for that matter, it's also similar in a number of Latin American countries. If you go there and trucks have to sit for 15 hours, 24 hours, just to be able to cross the border. If you are a large exporter, you probably have a truck that is a refrigerated truck, so your produce will not rotten. If you are a small holder, you are probably there sitting with your truck filled with tomatoes and lettuces, and if you have to sit under the sun for 15 hours, your product will simply not make it to the market. So to me, the issue of trade facilitation is one that is extremely important in promoting inclusive integration into supply chains, particularly by small farm holders. Now again, this goes more broadly into the design of each operation in making sure not only that you are helping to connect to value chains, to expand or strengthen participation in value chains, but also to make value chains a key element of this sustainability growth strategy. Now, there are, as we have seen, tragedies in many places. So this is not to say that you do not need to work on this with a clear purpose. But having said that, I've seen actually global value chains serve as an instrument to promote the upscaling of standards in many, many countries. In terms of multi-staker collaboration, I think that this is, as I was saying, very relevant when thinking about global value chains. And the key here is to bring all relevant actors to the table. To me, that is the criteria. It may sound like a very general criteria, but when you're thinking about how can you make sure that a country can graduate a higher number of engineers, you need to have at the table the universities, but you also need to have at the table the companies, and you need to have at the table the government. One interesting thing about this participation in global value chains is that from my experience in Costa Rica, I remember IBM establishing a very large operation in the country to work in the area of providing data security for a number of their clients. This was a very high-end services center that they had in the country. In order for them to do that, they needed to grow the specialized human resources quite significantly. So they partnered with 6 universities to make this happen, and with the Ministry of Science and Technology to provide funding, scholarships for students to participate in these programs, with IBM providing the curricula and the training of the trainers, the training of the professors at the universities to make sure that they were at the high end of knowledge in this particular case. So you had here a very interesting example where you had new programs being developed at the public universities in the country, students being financed by the government to participate in these programs, and these programs actually being guided by one lead company in this area. So this is, I think, the kind of engagement that global value chain sort of provides you the umbrella or the context by which you can promote this type of multi-staker collaboration. Now, regional value chains, I think, are very important because not all countries can integrate into global value chains in the beginning. And regional value chains may provide an easier way to begin to connect to production networks. And certainly in the area of food, I think it's one where this is very evident. And if you actually look at what is already happening in some places, again, I think, for instance, that the work that is taking place in Central America, in this case connected through Walmart, taking food supplies that are produced in Central America and taking them to Mexico, and the other way around as part of an integration into a regional value chain in the area of food. So I think that in many places, in the example of, for instance, Southern Africa coming together and participating, by having some of the raw materials processed, for instance, in South Africa, is also another way of looking at this. Or the Pacific Country Alliance, countries, they're also looking at how can you take, for instance, fruits that are maybe produced in Colombia to produce juices in Chile to export to the Asian market. Well, all of these are, these are more simple value chains in many cases. They have lesser number of links or tasks that can be performed, but may be an initial way for many countries to actually begin to connect to value chains. Finally, the question on the special economic zone. If you come to think about it, special economic zones in many countries have provided the competitive spaces where global value chains can actually develop. And last time I saw, I think there were like 3,500 special economic zones all over the world. Now, there are many experiences of successful special economic zones, and there are many failures as well. I think that from the perspective of the World Bank Group, we want to learn both from the successful experiences and from the experiences that have not worked well. I think going to your specific question on the establishment of a Chinese special economic zone in Costa Rica, this is something that in my previous capacity as Minister of Foreign Trade, I supported quite significantly and worked with the China Development Bank to actually conduct a feasibility study for the establishment of this zone. One zone that we, since the beginning, conceived as a zone that would be a high-tech zone with very high labor and environmental standards, because this is something that for the country is very relevant. This would be the first project of this nature in Latin America. So I think, and I thought from that perspective, that the Chinese government was very keen in looking at developing a concept of special economic zone that included very high standards, as I said, from both the perspective of labor and environment. But from our perspective at the World Bank Group now, we currently we support a number of projects on special economic zones in many countries in the world, and we are always promote compliance with a number of environmental and labor safeguards that are precisely very relevant in making sure that we go to the route of sustainable and inclusive development.
Well, I think we can tell from the range of topics that Anabel has addressed and both the vision and the details of the answers that a life of experience here is really bearing fruit, especially in your new role in the World Bank of bringing the pieces together and using your experience to suggest a new way forward. So on behalf of the group here and certainly on behalf of our Duke Global Summit, I'd like to thank you for spending the time with us and sharing some of your experiences.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Very
much.
much. Thank you.